This lesson is about nationalism in the Middle East, and this is chapter 25, section 1. You can see from the map above the region of the world that we're going to be talking about. Now, before we dive in, I do want to take a moment to look at some historic maps so we can see how this relates to empires we have studied previously. Now, in this first map, we can see that the two dominant empires in the 1500s and 1600s were the Safavid Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And then if we move over to 1700s and 1800s, we see that the Persian Empire, Ottoman Empire, and Egyptian Empire dominated. And then getting into 1920, we can see how much different the region looks, and this is going to be our primary focus today, is the effects of what's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is where the British and the French drew the borders in the Middle East. So we can see 1920, so take a moment to look at that, and then we're going to compare this to 2002, so a more modern look at the map. So if we look at the more modern map, we notice this is now Saudi Arabia, this was previously Palestine, is now Israel. We see Yemen, Oman, United Arab Emirates are added. So those are just some changes in the modern map. Now the first thing that we're going to talk about is the Ottoman Empire. Now the Ottoman Empire we've discussed previously. At its height, it actually spanned 3 continents, which meant that it contained a broad range of cultures, religions, and languages. And it lasted for 623 years, so from 1299 to 1922. And some of the recipes for success, they were highly centralized government, they were ruled by a single family for 7 centuries, and they were united by Islam. Now, we're going to talk about today the factors that led to the end of the Ottoman Empire. So the first factor is related back to imperialism. So imperialism being where a stronger country overtakes a smaller country. And as part of imperialism, we see the European powers look to territory that made up the Ottoman Empire. They look to claim that territory to grow their own empires. So that was part of it, is the European powers taking parts of the Ottoman Empire for their own. Then we also see some economic problems that led to the end of the Ottoman Empire, such as competition from trade from the Americas and from India. They were just unable to compete. We see development of other trade routes, rising unemployment, so those are all economic problems. Next, we see the government becomes less centralized, which means that there's not central control anymore over the whole empire. And some other effects that we see, the sultans begin maintaining less strict religious adherence, and they just don't maintain that same high standard of governance that they did previously. So some results of these changes, the first is that Great Britain and France go on to make plans for how to divide the territory within the Ottoman Empire. And then the thing that is considered the nail in the coffin post-World War I is post-World War I, a treaty is signed to divide the Ottoman Empire, but the final nail was the Turkish War of Independence, which this resulted in the fall of Constantinople and the ultimate establishment of Turkey as a republic in 1923. Now you might be wondering, this empire lasted for 623 years, that's quite a long time, but actually the longest lasting empire is considered the Roman Empire. There's a debated start date, but it's agreed upon that the start date was around 27 BC when Emperor Augustus claimed himself as emperor, the first Roman emperor. And then the western part of the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, but the Eastern Empire continued, and that was based in Constantinople, based on Old Roman rule, fell in 1453. So that's technically considered the oldest. Now, the way that the political boundaries were determined in the Middle East is very similar to how they were determined in the Berlin Conference in Africa. What we see is that the European powers actually made agreements that determined how the borders would be drawn in the Middle East. And like we saw previously in our Berlin Conference simulation, they did this without taking into consideration the religious groups, the ethnic groups, and the tension that could cause. Instead, they were focused on how can they get access to the most resources. Next, what we're going to talk about are some political agreements that helped shape the Middle East into what it is today. The first is the Balfour Agreement, and this was in 1917, and this was just a promise that the British made to establish a Jewish homeland in what was Palestine. Next, we see the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which I mentioned at the beginning of the lesson, and this agreement is actually what was used to draw the borders and make individual nations of the Middle East. Next, under the League of Nations, which is the international peacekeeping organization, they are going to grant what are called mandates, and these are just territories that are going to go under French and British rule until the French and British determine that that territory is ready for independence. And lastly, in 1922, the League of Nations is going to establish that national homeland for the Jews. And what was concerning to the Arab nationalists is they wondered why a Jewish homeland would be established in an area of 98% Muslims. And as we've seen over and over in our current events, this has created conflict between religious groups that last into the modern era. Next, we're going to look at a map that shows the different borders that were established by these agreements and what those looked like. Here we see the red indicates what was previously borders of the Ottoman Empire. Some of the British mandates, Iraq, Egypt. Next we see French mandate, an example, Lebanon, Syria. We see the Jewish settlements, and then lastly we observe oil producing areas, which is our next point. Oil in the Middle East was discovered in the 1930s, and the major effect that this had on the Middle East is it drew Western nations who sought to profit from the oil industry. And this just led to a huge influx of, British and French and people from the US who came to get rich from the oil that was discovered. This is a map of what's called the oil corridor, so we can see where this is. And again, this has created conflict as these countries seek to control their own industries. They don't want the Western influence, or like we saw in the Iranian Revolution, they thought that the West had too much influence. And oil has also been used to, in some cases, keep dictators in power because they could just rely on the wealth of the oil to stay in power. This is the last part of the lesson where you see the questions that you have to answer. And this is a map of religious composition of the Middle East. If you want to see your own version, just click on the link. But what we see is the light green indicates Sunni Muslims, the dark green indicates Shia Muslims. Then we see the light purple Christianity, the orange Judaism. Next we see Zoroastrianism. And then I just ask for you to consider those questions there. So the first is write down your observations that you make about the distribution of religions in the Middle East. So think about what makes up the largest population, the smallest, which countries do you notice that they're primarily in? Next, the question is number 2. How could this religious distribution lead to problems within individual countries? And then that third question asks you to imagine that you've been tasked with redrawing the borders in the Middle East to make it politically as well as economically stable. So write down what changes you would make about the current borders and write down what you would keep the same in order to make it more stable. And lastly, don't forget to complete your summary, which is a 2 to 3 sentence summary of what you learned from this lesson about nationalism in the Middle East.